this video, we're going to use Excel to display data, and that is going to be using a frequency distribution, which is a frequency table, a pie chart, a bar graph, a side-by-side bar graph, a stacked bar graph, a histogram using a pivot table or frequency distribution, or a histogram without creating that distribution first, and then a line graph. The first thing I want to show you is how to create a frequency distribution, which is a frequency table. Now, many people are tempted to try to create the frequency distribution themselves. I only have 20 values here, so I could very easily say if I were asked to use a bin width of 100, I could create those bins myself, and I could start counting up how many should go in each of those bins. So there's two values in the 1500 to 1599. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 values here. But again, I don't want to have to do it myself. I want Excel to do the work for me. So instead, I'm going to go to the Insert tab, and I'm going to choose Pivot Table. Now, if I would have chosen the data before I clicked Pivot Table, notice it's going to pre-populate with HD TV prices, which is the page in which the data is located, and then A to A, which means column A. So the first step is to select your data. The second step is to choose where you want it to be placed. So I could do a new worksheet, and if I did that, it would just add a worksheet here to the bottom. Or I could choose the existing worksheet and choose the location. So I could choose to either say put it on this exact same page, or let's say I want to put it here on the frequency distribution page in column A. Notice when I get done, that's where it's going to go, is in column A. And then click OK. Notice now I have a pivot table, but I don't actually see anything in the pivot table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the variable name, in this case HDTV prices, and I'm going to drag it down to rows. And notice what happened is it took each of my data values and created a value here. So let's go back and look at this data. Notice here I had $16.99 4 times, and here I have $16.99 1 time, because again it's going to then count up when I create my next row or next column. It's going to count up how many times each of these values occurred. So to do that, I do the exact same thing. I'm going to drag it down to sum of values. Now I want you to notice that this says sum of TV prices. This is a frequency distribution, so I'm interested in how many times each occurred. So I don't want the sum. I'm going to, and we're going to get to this blank in just a moment. Instead of sum, I'm going to choose value field settings. I'm sorry that it's off the display, but if you choose the drop down, one of them is value field settings. And notice here it's selected as sum, but I can choose count. I can even name the column something that I want, like frequency. Now from here I can show values as just the count, so that would be no calculation. I could also create another column and again choose the value field settings, as I can see there, and show count, but this time go to show values as the percent of grand total. So if I were asked to see the relative frequency, or to show these as percentages, notice that that has done that for me as well. Now it's not necessary for you to do both. You might want to do just one or just the other, and you might want to show both. It's completely dependent on your situation. Now the other thing that I don't have fixed yet is, as I can see, each of the values in my left hand column are not grouped in bins of 100. Remember, I wanted a bin width of 100. So I'm going to right click any one of these values in the left hand column and choose group. Now when you do that, it automatically starts at the lowest number, automatically ends at the highest number, and chooses some bin width. Now we do want a bin width of 100. That's where it says by 100, so it guessed very well there. But remember, I want to start at 1500, so I have to uncheck that box, because if I check it, it's going to default to the lowest value. If I uncheck it, I get to choose to start at 1500. And of course, I'm going to leave this one at ending at 1999 because remember my bins would be 1500 to 1599, 1600 to 1699, all the way up to 1999. Clicking OK, as I can see, has now cleaned up my frequency distribution. The only thing now that I want to do is I don't like this row. Less than 1500 or blank doesn't have any data in it, and it's just a little bit confusing. So what I want is to go to the drop down next to my variable name and just deselect or unselect that row. And notice now I've got my row labels, which again I could rename that column. I've got my frequency, and then I could rename this as relative frequency the same way that I did before. So if I went over here to value field settings, and I could call this relative frequency. Again, those are your options, and that is the easiest way to allow Excel to create your frequency distribution for you. Now let's take a look at how to create a pie graph or pie chart in Excel. I'm going to start with just the same data that I just ended with. So if I were asked to create a pivot table or a frequency distribution first, then create a pie chart from those values, I would just go to Insert. So notice I've highlighted those values. Go to Insert and then the one that looks like a circle graph and choose 2D pie. Now notice here I have two columns going on, and I really don't need both of those columns. So obviously you would look at what distribution better suits your needs. It's the same values. This is just given in count and this is in relative frequency. So I can just choose, if I wanted the relative frequency values, I can just choose to remove that field. Notice it removes it from my pivot table and also removes it from the buttons up here. Now what I have is a title, HDTV prices, that I can change. And if you don't have a title, you're just going to go to the the design tab and go to add chart element. So here is where you can go to no title, above the chart like we had it, a centered overlay. Typically I just choose above the chart. I can also choose data labels. So notice here I can choose for them to be in the center, and notice on my graph they're showing up as the percentages, inside, outside, wherever I want them to be. I might be asked to show a specific decimal place, and so if that's the case I might actually have to change a little bit about my pivot table. I might have to change some of those field settings. So notice here this is shown as a count, and I chose show values as percent of grand total, but I might want it to be a percentage with 0 decimal places. So you can play with that as much as you need to make it fit your needs, but notice that gives my circle graph a much cleaner look. So just pay attention to whatever instructions you're asked. If you need a certain amount of decimal places, here in this case it didn't make my values any less precise because each of those percentages were 0.00. Again, the other values that I can look at is make sure that you have the circle graph highlighted, but I can choose the design tab and change where the legend is located, on the left, on the bottom, on the right, wherever it fits my needs. And that's going to be the same if I have another set of data. Again, this is not relative frequency. I would still do the same thing. Insert 2D pie and then choose where I want the data labels to be. If I want data labels, change the title. If I want to choose where the legend is going to be, you know, any of the values, any of the aspects of our chart that you would like to choose. You can also choose, there's quite a few up here. Notice that these are going to give you just a little bit of flair, but it's not necessary for you to choose any of those. You can choose anything that you need over here under Add Chart Element. I'm going to use that same data now to create a bar graph. And so again, I'm going to select the same data that I did before and just go to Insert and Bar Graph. And again, most of the work is done for me, so I can leave it just like that, or I can obviously change the title to Housing Choices. Things that you'll want to pay attention to is if you don't want them all to be the same color, you can just click on one of the bars and choose Vary Colors by Point, and it changes the colors. I can change the border. I can change by double clicking on the values or right clicking on the values. I can format the axis and change the minimum and maximum values. One thing you'll probably want to include is in Add Chart Element, go to Access Titles, and you can add each axis, the vertical and the horizontal axis. That was my fault. And so here I would write frequency, and here are housing choice. Again, a lot of different options, but that's the very, very basics. I don't need to worry because, and this is very important to understand, this is a bar graph, and in a bar graph we're dealing with categorical data, just like we did in our pie graph. And when we're dealing with categorical data like this, apartment, dorm, house, sorority or fraternity house, you don't and shouldn't have these bars touching one another because each of these things is a separate category. We're going to work with histograms in just a few minutes, and when we do a histogram, it is a number line on that x-axis, and therefore these bars should touch. But for a bar graph like this, our bars should not be touching, and so that's all I have to do for this display. We're now going to create a side-by-side bar graph, and we're just going to do it by selecting our other column of data, so the third column, column C. I'm still going to go to Insert, and I'm still going to go to the 2D bar graph. And so again, you can see it does most of the work for me. I can change the chart title to Housing Options. I can add the same axis titles that I did before. And so this would be frequency, oops, and this would be housing choice. You obviously can change the colors of each. I can do that by clicking here or right clicking. I can change the fill to something different. It's really up to you what you want your graph to look like. The other thing that you might want to change is, notice here on my data I didn't have data set A or data set B, or let's say this is a East Campus and West Campus or something. So if I go to nope, that's not right. If I go down here to select data, so notice I've selected the Series 1, Series 2 and select data, I can edit this to say East Campus and edit this to say West Campus. So obviously there's a lot of options, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but you get the idea that you have quite a few options for how you want your graph to look. Again, dealing with this categorical data or qualitative data, if I want to compare two options, as I did for my side-by-side bar graph, I can create a stacked bar graph, again going to the 2D column, but this time choosing the stacked display. And so as I can see, it's now going to stack them one on top of each other. Again, as I did on the last one, I can right click here and select data to change it to East Campus, West Campus. I can change the chart title. I can add the access titles for each side. So a lot of the same options I had before. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is you can change this gap width, and I can change it to say 20%. And notice all that's going to do is just make them fatter. Again, because this is categorical data or qualitative data, we don't want the bars to touch, but you can certainly make the bars wider if you choose. There are actually two ways to create a histogram using Excel. So obviously we've switched back now to our quantitative data. And if you've already created a pivot table, as we have for our HDTV prices, you can use that data to create a bar graph, or a histogram, excuse me. So notice I've selected just the data, and if I go to insert, I can choose the exact same options we were using before with our bar graph. And so here is not quite a histogram yet, but it's a good start. Again, I can change the title to Housing Choices. I can still create the options for my axis titles. Notice I did it a little bit differently this time, but I can have both axis titles. I can do data labels, and I don't really need that in this case. So again, this would be frequency, and this would be price. Because this is a histogram and not a bar graph, it's important that these bars are touching. So notice if I just click on one of the bars, I can go ahead and change the colors if I want, and I can change the border so that it stands out a little bit, which is a little bit more important when you're doing a histogram. Oops, I wanted that to be for all of them. And of course it's going to be difficult now. There we go. Now I've already varied colors by point. I'm going to add the outline, and again, then if I click on this series options, I'm going to make my gap width 0. And again, that's because this is a number line and it is continuous. And so if that's all we need to do, then of course you're done. Sometimes, however, they ask us, especially as you're going through your textbook, they ask our label here to be the midpoint. And so if you need to change the label to the midpoint, I can just go back up to my pivot table and change that to the midpoint manually. So 1550, 1650, 1750, 1850, 1950. And notice those changed automatically on the display because my display was made from my pivot table. I want to show you the other way now that you can create a histogram without first creating a pivot table. The first thing you need to do is you need to understand a little bit about histograms, in that if I have bins that go from 1500 to 1599 and then 1600 to 1699, remember that there's a boundary, a class boundary between those values, and it's up to you to come up with that boundary. So 1599 to 1600, if I average those two, I get 1599.5. And so I'm going to do that for each boundary: 1799.5, 1899.5, 1999.5. I always forget that 1999.5. And those are going to be our boundaries. And it's important that you come up with those correctly, because that's going to tell Excel that they're going to put everything from 1500 up to 1599.5 into the first bin, and to 1699.5 into the second bin. Now from here, I need to make sure that I have a data analysis option here. If this is not showing up under your data tab, data analysis, you need to enable it. Go to File, down to Options, and under Add-ins there is Excel Add-ins Analysis Toolpack. You'll need to turn that on. Mine's already on, so I don't need to turn it on, so I'm just going to go back to my main page. Now I'm going to go to the data analysis option and choose histogram. And as you can see, I have some values in here already. Typically you won't have anything in here it'll just be blank. And so I'm going to start from there. So for my input range, that's the data. Now I can choose to either select just the data values and not click labels because I have not highlighted the label, or what I typically do is just choose the entire column and then click labels. Because I've clicked labels, notice that's why I wrote a label here for bin range. So my bin range are just my boundaries. So I'm going to choose actually just those values. For output range, I can choose a new worksheet ply, which would create a new page, a new workbook, which would create a whole new document. I'm going to keep the output right here on the same page. So I'm going to put the output right here in C10, just because it was a blank page. Or maybe I could even put it here right underneath my other pivot table. Now what it's going to do is in D10, it's going to create a display very similar to the one I had here. I need to make sure that I click this box that says chart output, because chart output is then going to create a histogram from that data. Oops, I have something wrong. What did I do? Oh, I think I just clicked it more than once. So for my input range, again, is just A. Now notice what has happened. They have the boundaries here, and then the frequency here. And again, I don't need this more. It's not important, but I have everything I need here. It's the same histogram. Whoops, I did not mean to do that. Now, what did I do to turn my old histogram into the beauty that you see here? Again, I double-clicked on the bars, and I chose to make a gap width of 0. I double-clicked on the little paint can and chose to make them different colors. I added the axis titles and labels. So all of the same things that you did before you're going to do again, so I'm not going to do that again. But the other thing is, if they need for you to have the class midpoint, as sometimes they ask you to do, then I would again just go through and edit those myself. 1550, 1650, 1750, 1850, 1950. And again, notice it changed them right on the histogram. The last thing we're going to do is to create a line graph. And a line graph is used when we want to track changes over time. And you might be tempted to just highlight your data and go to Insert and then to Line Graph. And as you can see, that's not what I want to do, because it has just given me changes in year and changes in CPI, and that's not what I want. So instead, I'm going to just go to, without any data highlighted, I'm going to go to Insert and create that 2D line graph, which gives me just a blank space. If I right click on that, I can then select the data. And the data that I want is, I want to add the CPI data. So the series name, I'm going to put CPI by year. And for series values, I'm going to choose these values. And notice it creates a line graph for me, but on the horizontal axis it has just a generic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I want it to show the year. So over on this right side where it says horizontal category axis labels, I'm just going to go to Edit and select the corresponding years and click OK. And then I can see that it's now created the line graph for me. As we did before, you can change the title, you can add the access titles as we did before, you can add really anything that we need to add. So I'm going to let you kind of play with those options yourself. But again, that is the easiest way to create a line graph of your data.